You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or their affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch UK Radio.
Hello my lovelies, how are you? Hope you're doing well. Yes, it's a Wednesday, which means it's History Wednesday, and it's yours truly talking all things historical and haunted. What have you all been up to this week? Well, I was lucky enough on Saturday to pay a visit with the amazing ladies from the Paranormal Sisters to the Hitchin School. It was British Schools Museum, and we did it was a public event, and lucky enough to be joined by some very, very lovely people on it. And yeah, we did an investigation, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more about it at some point, because I think I will be doing a show on it at some point. Hopefully there's a certain guest who works there who said he's interested when he gets around to emailing me back, and he's going to be my guest, so that should be very, very good. But it was a very, very interesting night. So I know Kerry mentioned it in the live on Monday, something to do with she thought it was a table tipping thing, that the table jumped under my arms. No, it wasn't table tipping. It was one of the desks in the monitorial classroom, or the gallery classroom, sorry. I was leaning on it, sort of leaning forward on this desk, and I'm not joking, it vibrated really fast under my arms and then sort of moved. First thing I did, check in it, check under it, check my mobile phone wasn't switched on and was vibrating. No, nobody else felt it, but they all heard me they heard it make the noise and heard me squeal as I sort of jumped backwards. It was a very interesting night, and I know I wasn't the only one to experience some interesting experiences there. So it's definitely one to go to, and even as a museum it's absolutely fascinating, and the volunteers who work there, and it is a volunteer museum, it's not sort of run by Hertfordshire County Council or anything like that. They do run it as their own and you always find with these kind of places that people have put their own personal time and effort into are just second to none when it comes to the passion and everything that they show when they're showing you around or explaining things to you, or just their desire to learn more and more and more and more about their chosen thing, as you could call it. But it's definitely one I can recommend to go to. What else have I been up to? Well, it's just been announced I will be one of the special guests at Haunted Magazine's new Usborne book launch on the 19th of October at Bosworth Hall Hotel. I'm one of the sort of special guests. Hi SJ, I'm one of the special guests who's going to be there, but you can come along too. I believe there's still tickets available. Go and check out Haunted Magazine if you're interested, and yeah, go and check out Haunted Magazine if you'd like to go along and buy one of the tickets. There's going to be a few special guests there, and you get a free copy of the book, I believe, and you also, I think, you get to do a mini ghost hunt, and you're going to get to see a first screening of an exclusive film as well. So there you go. Why would you not want to go? And yeah, you get to come and share a beer with me, I guess, as long as you're buying. I'm a skinflint, me. So enough waffle. Well, tonight's show, I seriously don't know why I do this to myself. I mean, I love my history, and everyone knows I love my aviation, and I love my wars and everything else. But when I decided that, because of the original show that was going to be on tonight had to be cancelled, unfortunately, and I thought, what would I like to talk to? Well, one of my Parasearch colleagues had been visiting somewhere recently that he very kindly sent me an email and said, God, Pen, if you haven't been to this place, you gotta go. And I thought, oh, rookie, amateur, of course I've been to this particular place. But then I started thinking, well, if someone else I know has been to this sort of place who's got a similar interest in history to me, wouldn't it be a cracking show? And that's how this show came about, although it's a pretty broad subject, so I don't think I'm going to cover it with my guest in the next hour, all of it, but we'll certainly give it a good go. Now here's my guest with a few words before we start.
Never in the field of human conflict has so much been known by so many to so few.
Very nicely done, Mr. Clements. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Penny. Yes, it's a very long time since I've had to do a Winston Churchill.
Have you got the cigar ready?
Well, at least I can put it out now, and I was choking a bit. I did appear once at a fancy dress as Winston Churchill, but everyone thought I'd turned up as Bud Flanagan, but at least I tried.
Well, he's an interesting character, is that? Most people get him confused for Alfred Hitchcock.
Well, yeah, I suppose they do, actually, yeah.
The amount of times I've had to say to an American, no, that's Churchill, that's not Hitchcock, and vice versa. I suppose the bald head, the cigar, that sort of whole look, are two very different people.
I can probably pull off a better sort of likeness now, because when I went to the fancy dress, I had hair all them years ago, so that probably threw a few people, but anyway.
So it was you who kindly sent me the email about this museum. And I did think, oh, so sweet, you're thinking of me, and I do appreciate it when you send me this history stuff. I really do, even though I might send you the odd sarcastic message back saying, duh, I kind of know about this, but I do appreciate it. That's just my sarcasm. But it was a day trip. I think, did you go with Paul Rook?
Yes, I went with Paul Rook. We often sort of go out and about at the weekends just to visit sort of places of interest. Most of them have a paranormal link, but some don't, and we do like our museums as well. We've sort of done Bletchley Park. That was our sort of first road trip, sort of way back in April, I believe. So this is becoming a little regular thing. But a couple of weeks ago, just over a conversation, we thought we would head over into Kent, because we usually pick a county first and then we sort of scratch our heads and say, where do we go? And then somebody else actually suggested, why not the Kent Battle of Britain Museum, just outside Folkestone at the place escapes me.
Hawkinge.
At the old RAF and Hawkinge base.
Yeah,
so off we went. I programmed it into the sat-nav and off we went. It's not that far from us here in Chelmsford.
No, it's not.
So we had a very good run down there, and we got there for about midday and sort of spent a good couple of hours actually going around the museum. And I was very impressed with it. It is a very good museum. We sort of went in through the main sort of like door, and there's sort of like it takes you straight into the gift shop, and a very well stocked gift shop. We paid our fee, £8, which is very good, I thought. Unfortunately, they don't let you take in photography equipment or mobile phones, etc. They cite security reasons. So that was a bit disappointing, because I did want to get some photos. But I did post a gallery up on the page, and I managed to lift some photos offline. So there is some up there. So we went into the first hangar, and the first sort of like aircraft we come, which not too many people actually know about. They know about the main two, was the Bolton Pool Defiant. They have, it's half original, half replica.
Yeah.
It was found in a farmer's barn, which these sorts of things usually happen. And there was the Bolton Pool Restoration Society had actually restored this aircraft and had it in the hangar, which is a very interesting aircraft to sort of like have a look around and to actually look at, because it does have a very like distinguishing feature.
It does, doesn't it? It's the it's one of the ones, like you were saying, most people have heard of the Spitfire. That's the most iconic one that people tend to mention when you talk about World War II fighter aircraft, or British World War II fighter aircraft. The next one down the list is normally the Hurricane. And yes, they probably were the most prolific. Well, the Hurricane certainly was. But the Defiant was actually, I mean, it was invaluable, I would have said, during Dunkirk, mere months before the Battle of Britain, which is what we're going to be talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And that distinguishing feature that you mentioned was its gun turret.
Yes, it was doesn't look that dissimilar to the Hurricane, and but directly behind the cockpit is a domed gun turret with 4 .303 machine guns mounted in it. The sort you would see on the top of the Lancaster bomber or a heavy bomber, those sorts of turrets they have on the top. And it's exactly like that. And but the only sort of downside is they couldn't fire forward. So the pilots had to be quite skilled and have quite a bit of nerve. You had to actually get in amongst the aircraft and either fire sideways on or, as we were talking before the show, Penny, during the Dunkirk evacuation, a lot of Messerschmitts did actually mistake them for Hurricanes and came in from behind and were actually downed. They weren't expecting to be shot at by the plane they're pursuing. So that was quite a sort of unique feature of it, but I think the Luftwaffe got wise to them eventually. I mean, the Bolton Pool has been much maligned, but the pilots that actually flew it are very proud of it, loved it, and it actually got the nickname of the Daffy. They affectionately called the aircraft, and they actually have one of these at the museum, which is very interesting in itself. And it went on really sort of. It didn't take a main part in the daytime battles of the Battle of Britain, but it went on to become quite a successful night fighter against heavy coming over.
Yeah, no, spot on. You've done your research. You've read that book through already, haven't you?
Well,
the Battle of Britain book that you and I discovered we both have.
Yeah, the good old works always comes up.
So, well, let's go back a bit and talk about the Battle of Britain itself. Now, hi Wes, thank you for joining us all the way from Canada. Now, interestingly enough, Wes is in the chat room, and one of the shows that we did was on a place called Picton Heights, and Picton Heights was it was Canadian Air Force, but it was actually part of what was used for the Arnold project back in, I think it was about 1942, 1943, so after the Battle of Britain. But that part of the world had links with, they were trying to fast train fighter pilots. And one of the shows Wes and I did, and hopefully I'm going to get to visit it next year when I get out to Canada, is this place Picton Heights that was an RAF base. And it was actually my grandfather was based in Canada at an RAF base not that a million miles away, working on this thing called the Arnold project during World War II. So there's an awful lot of synchronicity there. But so let's go back. Battle of Britain. So it's one of those things that historians do get a bit how shall I put it, arsey about, because people like dates. They like parameters for battles. And so the best argument is that the Battle of Britain took place from the 10th of July 1940 to the 31st of October 1940.
Yes. I mean, it was sort of like a continuous sort of air battle, but it wasn't continuous per se, and there were days when there was no activity, it was a lull. It was sort of just a name for a general time span.
Although there were times when it was non-stop, but we'll come on to that in a minute. Now, what I find a bit sad about this, and I know an awful lot of pilots have commented on how they find it quite tragic, is that pilots who died just before the 10th of July, which could kind of have been said it was the basis of Hitler throwing everything at us by air, they're not included on any of the Battle of Britain memorials because they died outside those dates. And
I didn't realise.
There was a couple mentioned at I've got a book called Ghosts of Biggin Hill, and it was a couple mentioned there who, even because there's not sort of set dates, and like I say, historians like to have I suppose there were parameters, dates to sort of fit things into nice little boxes. there were some quite, excuse me, top pilots who died early July, literally 2 or 3 days before the 10th, who aren't included on the Battle of Britain memorials, which I do find quite sad, because they would, nobody knows that's exactly when this sort of bombardment from Hitler with, what was it, Operation Sea Lion and all that type of stuff that he'd started. However, those are the dates that historians like to class it by. Now, they say that the concentration of activity was worst, I think it was during August into sort of early September.
Yes.
And I think one of the best films, if you're not a book reader and watching history documentaries sort of isn't your favourite thing, if you watch the film Battle of Britain that was filmed in the late 1960s, that does actually give quite a good account of what it was like and what happened.
That is a very good film, and as you say, Penny, that does give a very good account. And it so happens when we visited the museum, and it actually coincided with the 50th year of the release of the movie. So that's just a little side note, but yes, it is quite an accurate portrayal.
It is. I mean, the fact that I think it was Laurence Olivier played Dowding. Now, Dowding was the guy in charge of Fighter Command, Air Vice Marshal. Yeah, it's Vice Marshal, wasn't it? Air Vice Marshal Dowding, Hugh Dowding. And I was reading an account that when they were filming it, Dowding actually went to, I think it was Hawkinge they were filming at that point, and he sat behind the desk that Olivier showed him where he'd been sitting. Now, Olivier himself was a pilot in World War II. He flew Fleet Air Arm, interestingly enough. So, and a lot of the people in Battle of Britain would have, it was only in the late 60s, as you say, so a lot of them would have known things that had gone on 25 years previously.
Well, yeah,
similar with The Great Escape and all those kind of war films. An awful lot of the people in them had wartime fighting experiences, as I've written in some of the blogs that I've written. But apparently Dowding actually said that it was actually a pretty accurate portrayal of what it was like. So short of being there, he actually gave it the seal of approval, which I think when you've got the head of Fighter Command actually saying, yeah, this film's not bad, can't really get much better than that, can you?
Turn up on set, sit down, have a look round. Yeah, that is the seal of approval. Yeah. But yes, I've watched the film several times. It's probably one of the only films I can watch sort of.
Oh, I can watch it on loop. I really can. I love that. And The Great Escape, that's another one I can watch and watch and watch and watch. But no, the Battle of Britain, I remember the first time my parents sort of said to me, I think you might enjoy this. I was about 17 or 18. And I was glued from... It's not a short film. I was glued from start to finish. But we'll refer back to that, I think, as we go along, because I think there's salient points in that. But one of my favourite facts from the Battle of Britain is when they blew up that hangar in the film, when the hangar gets bombed. I think it was actually at Duxford. They did actually blow the hangar up, and they had to do it in one shot. They couldn't do it again, so it had to be perfect. Yeah. Which,
because the hangar was scheduled for
demolition.
Demolition. They thought, we can use it for the film. So yeah,
and that is a true fact. They only had one shot. They had to get it perfect. So it kind of, when you walk around somewhere like Duxford, which was a Battle of Britain site, albeit under Group 12, under my mind's just gone blank, Lee Mallory, and we're going to talk about Lee Mallory and Park shortly. It was actually still a Battle of Britain site, and they did actually genuinely blow up the hangar. So I that's one of my favourite facts. When I've actually seen it in a pub quiz before. Is it true that they blew up a hangar at Duxford in the filming of Battle of Britain? Yes, it is. So there you go. There's a little nugget of information for you there. So we've got this battle that's going on overhead, for sort of roughly 3 months in the sort of middle to end of, or middle to sort of, I suppose you could say autumn in 1940. It was meant to have been because it was meant to have been part of Hitler's invasion plans for the UK, that he thought if he threw the Luftwaffe at us, we'd capitulate and he'd be able to come by sea, and, little old England, they're not going to be able to stand up to the might of the Luftwaffe.
it's one of the prerequisites to, well, any victory campaign is to try and neutralise your
bomb the shit out of them.
Air force,
Yeah.
to get air superiority is a priority
Yeah.
to launch, particularly a seaborne invasion.
Yeah.
Mm.
And we all know it didn't work. We all know that now. But what I find interesting is looking at the sacrifices that were made, looking at some of the facts that were made about it, and also looking at some of the little childish Barneys that were going on in the upper management in the whole process. But Hawkinge was a very important RAF base because, as many people know, if you look at the map of England, Kent, which is where Hawkinge is actually the south east of England. It's the closest bit to France, where a lot of the Luftwaffe were flying in from. So an awful lot of the battles took place over that particular part of the UK. But not all of them, but a lot of them, the concentration of them. Now, the group that covered that part of the UK was Group 11 under Keith Park, Sir Keith Park. And the different groups, so you had you had more than one group, obviously, but all the different groups were coordinated from Fighter Command, which was at a place called Bentley Priory. Have you been there, Richard? Have you been to Bentley Priory?
No, I haven't.
It's on my to-do list. It's on my to-do list. It looks fascinating.
The only Battle of Britain ops room I've actually visited is in Ongar, and I can't remember.
Ongar?
No, yes, it's just outside of Ongar. There's a manor house there, Blake's Hall, I believe. There's
they had
Battle.
one in there.
Yes, there's a Battle of Britain's ops room in there as well.
Because the big one is at Uxbridge, isn't it? The big one's at
Yes.
what was RAF Uxbridge. That's classed as the Battle of Britain operations room. But yeah, so Bentley Priory was where Fighter Command headquarters was, basically where Dowding was based. And and in fact, when you watch the film, The Battle of Britain, they do shots at Bentley. There's a museum now there that looks incredibly interesting and is on my to-do list to do at some point. Oh, by the way, hi Jeanette, thank you for joining us, and thanks for that, Wes. Wes has just told us that his uncle, who he's actually named after, flew Handley Hampton bombers.
Yeah,
and that's who he's named after. So there you go.
Oh, right.
More links. But yeah, so Bentley's another one that I think maybe we all need to do a road trip to, so that I can I can
certainly
talk in Kerry's ear about World War II until she sort of tells me to no more, Penny, no more. Anyway, so it was all coordinated from Bentley, and then it would go out to their relevant group headquarters. The HQ for Group 11, the one under Park, was in Uxbridge, and that was what basically controlled, you could probably say, Essex, Kent, and parts of Sussex. And Group 11 was the one that was most heavily used during the Battle of Britain. They would have then got backed up by Group 12 under Lee Mallory, and Group 12 was places like Duxford, so you're looking sort of slightly out of the southeast area, I suppose, for want of a better term. Now, so living in Essex, we've got an awful lot of the former bases near us, a lot of the fighter bases. One of the ones that's actually in the process, and I don't know if you know this, that's in the process of actually putting in a museum, finally, they've got the approval, is RAF Hornchurch. They've actually requisitioned an old building that was, I think it was a hospital building, and they've got a Battle of Britain museum, or a World War II, shall we say, RAF Hornchurch museum that they're in the process of putting in place, because RAF Hornchurch was where some of the Battle of Britain squadrons were based. You've also got North Weald. North Weald Airfield is still an operational airfield. And you've got the North Weald Airfield Museum, of which I'm a member. A very good little museum. It's set in what would have been the old station commanders' offices, basically a sort of detached 1920s house that was used as the station commanders' offices, because at the time it was at the entrance to the airfield. Fascinating museum. But what I was saying about places like I mentioned, the school that I investigated, these are all volunteer run places. None of them are run by the RAF, none of them are run, these ones I'm mentioning anyway, none of them are run by the local council. They were all run by volunteers and trustees, and I think it really tells when you go in. Because I think Hawkinge is run by volunteers and trustees, isn't it?
Yes, but I was very impressed with the setup there. It's just classed as a county museum run by a trust, but this could quite easily pass for a national museum.
It could. I mean, the Passion, I know when I went there sort of 9 years ago, they were so excited if you got excited. Does that make sense? They wanted you to really enjoy, and I know when I think I was looking at one of the old logbooks and getting quite sort of chucked up at the sort of looking at the logbooks and the entries, and the fact that at the height of the Battle of Britain, and this is something that makes me feel tired just thinking about it, the pilots would be woken up at 3:45 in the morning to be ready for action by 5 a.m.
Yes, first light. Yeah.
At first light, and on average they were being scrambled 3 times a day.
Yes.
And as soon as that bell rang, they had less than 3 minutes to be in their aircraft and in the sky.
And those sort of like 3 minutes, and they were very critical. I mean, they would have trained to do that because one of the advantages we had was obviously radar, and we did know that the planes were actually coming over, but it also gave us, just that edge to get off the ground quicker and to gain height. You needed to gain height, and it would take a little while to get up to gain the height so you can get above your bomber streams as they come in, and then go down to attack them.
Because the bombers would have been coming in at probably about 10,000-15,000 feet to try and keep away from the fighters. A lot of them would have had fighter escorts. So it's the fighter escorts. I mean, that's the interesting thing. When I've been doing I did some research for I'm gonna drop the new book. I was looking into how the Americans did it with the Liberators, and what they tended to do. They'd be flying in at about 10,000 feet with their fighter escort at about 15,000 feet, so the Germans would come in at the height of the bombers to try and pick them off, and the next thing they knew is the fighters were diving, the Mustangs and such like were diving from height to take them out because they would be unexpected. So there was no reason why the Luftwaffe wouldn't do something similar to protect their bombers.
That standard sort of textbook thing. You have your bombers, and then you have your fighter escorts above to sort of overview, and when your bombers get bounced, as they say, your escort fighters can come down and engage.
But 3 scrambles a day. I mean, it's kind of. I was reading an account. I just got it right where I put the notes. It was from a wing commander, Tom Neal, who was he only passed. I think he passed away recently. And he said in 16 weeks he was scrambled 157 times.
Yes,
in a 16-week period. The stress, their bodies and minds, and these were babies. This is the thing that these were men. I think the youngest man to die was Keith Gilman, who was 19, the youngest pilot. The average age was 24.
That's right.
And I just think that the amount of young energy that these... I can't imagine 22, 23-year-olds being able to do that. I mean, 150 scrambled 157 times in 16 weeks. It's just mind-blowing.
It's the sort of like the stress those pilots were sort of under. It was literally eat, sleep. Sort of. I should imagine sort of. You just waited for the sun go down and then just go back to your barracks and just crash out.
You'd think, wouldn't you? You'd think, but reading this Ghost of Biggin Hill, they used to sequester a lot of the local manor houses for officers' mess and officers' quarters. Yeah. And this family, they basically lived in their kitchen and their basement while the pilots, or the officers, shall we say, had free run of the rest of the building. And they said they wouldn't sleep. Half of them would literally go through the whole night because they were so hyped up from the sorties they'd flown that they couldn't sleep. They actually were setting up. They used to get told off by their commanding officers because one of them decided to turn one of the houses into a quasi nightclub, and actually had a jazz pianist and jazz singer hired to perform every night when they came back from the airfield. I mean, but then again, these are young men. You can't sort of. What are you going to do? They're potentially going to die or get severely injured every time they go to work. Is anyone going to tell them off for having a bit of fun?
You work hard, you play hard.
And they certainly did, by the sounds of it, some of them. But is that sort of that kind of pressure? I mean, it's probably 3 scrambles a day. Probably doesn't sound too much, but when you think you're going up there, you've got to have eyes in the back of your head. You're on your own in effect. I mean, you'll have your rest of your squadron, hopefully, but it's not like there's a whole gang of you up there. A lot of times you would get separated and encounter dogfights and all of that kind of thing. And I know you said you had a few personal stories from family members about the Battle of Britain. I had one from a client who actually lived in Biggin Hill during World War II. Oh. And he remembers he was in his bedroom. I remember him telling me this story, and he said he was looking out of his window and he saw a Messerschmitt that had been shot and was heading straight towards his bedroom. And as he said, he could see the pilot's eyes and the pilot sort of gesticulating at him to get out the way. And at that point, he said his dad just grabbed him and hurled him down the stairs as the Messerschmitt clipped the front of his house and crashed.
Really?
Yeah. And another story he said was he was playing out in the field because he said your parents would try and keep it as normal as possible. You're a kid at the end of the day. They don't want to scare you. And he did have a dogfight going on above him, like 500, 600 feet above his head. And he said he was just engrossed because at 6, 7 years old, he didn't realise what the danger was. To him, it was just 2 aeroplanes shooting at each other, and that was cool. But yeah, I mean, it would have been amazing to see, but wow, that must have been, yeah. And that was Biggin Hill, which was one of the worst hit areas.
You're living through one of the most sort of like pivotal moments in sort of British history, and it's happening above your head, you know. But you're there at the time, aren't you? And you don't. Most of the people I know were children at the time. Well, particularly my parents, and you know, because the Battle of Britain actually took place, as you were saying, it took place above my dad's house whilst he was in the garden watching it. I think
really?
That is.
Are you from Kent originally then?
Just a bit over, yeah, but yeah, and he used to say, you know, he used to be out in the garden watching. They were quite high up. It was just contrails and stuff you used to see, but you know, just in the distance. So you know, and he was a 9-year-old just sort of standing there watching it.
It would have been. I mean, I've always said I would have found it breathtaking to see a whole sort of squadron of Lancasters flying over my house, because the noise they must have made must have been phenomenal. But to see 2 talented fighters literally going at it. But some of the rumours, one of the rumours that I read about was they actually, you know, Hermann Goering, who was basically the head of the Luftwaffe, he was an ex-World War I ace.
Yeah, fighter ace, yes.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of these guys were. I mean, Dowding was, Parks was, I think he was Kiwi actually, Keith Parks. He was a fighter ace. So was Lee Mallory. I mean, most of them were World War I fighter aces who had been Royal RAC and then become RAF when it changed in 1918 to the RAF. But one of the rumours was that Goering did actually fly over with one of the squadrons to see what was going on in a jet, in a Messerschmitt, just to see what was going on. Yeah, and they've never found proof that he didn't, but they've never found proof that he did, because obviously if someone had known that the head of the Luftwaffe was above their skirt, he would have been a prime target.
Yeah, something you wouldn't advertise, would it?
No. But to be honest, having read up on him and knowing what an arrogant twat he was, it wouldn't surprise me. It really wouldn't surprise me if he did something like that.
Churchill always wanted to get into the action, you know. He was sort of, you know, and they had to hold him back from a few situations he wanted to go on, you know. So you never know. You never know.
Right, Wes has asked, could your dad hear the air raid sirens, or did he just not care?
Yes, but they didn't have an Anderson shelter, which is the one in the garden. They had a Morrison shelter, which is a metal table inside. It's a dining room metal table. But these sort of dogfights used to happen so high up. You just used to stand there and watch them, and the whole street used to come out.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I've seen quite a lot of accounts of that. Yeah.
Mainly, the air raid sirens would go off for sort of bombing raids, sort of nighttime raids and stuff. And that was the time. But sort of
V1s and V2s when they were coming over.
Yeah, but they used to have an air raid siren, but they didn't really pay a lot of attention to it because my grandfather used to say to my grandmother, apparently, that if he was going to die and he wanted to die in bed. So
I don't blame him. I think a lot of people felt like that, actually, especially because you'd had the year of the phony war as well.
Yeah.
And it was really 1940 that they started saying, they're going to drop gas on us and gas us all and blah, blah, blah. And in fact, I was also reading a story, I think it was a factory in Kent that manufactures something to do with sugar, and a bomb got dropped on it, and it released this plume of gas from this sugar. Sort of, don't know, I'm not a chemist, I don't know what was happening, but locals were suddenly adamant they were being gassed because all this gas was rising from this factory, and they were like gas bombs, they reckon, that had been dropped, not the plumes of sugar rising into the air or something like that. So there was an awful lot of propaganda and fear sort of permeated through the air, through the skies.
Everyone's nerves must have been on edge, and you can understand sort of things like that actually happening. So
we've got it's sweet, yes, very funny, Wes. Wes has just put sweet, yeah, ha ha ha. Yes, it probably was. So we've got these young men, and they were young men. And I'm not being sexist because we're not talking about the ATA girls. We're talking about the pilots who flew in the Battle of Britain. They were young men, average age 24, putting themselves, potentially having, flying, going up is an emergency, I'll put it that way, it's 3 times a day, having been up since 4 o'clock in the morning, not knowing if that was going to be the last time they ever went up. And it's going on and on. Now, they did rotate pilots out of 11 Group because of the stress of what they were having to deal with. So 11 Group were rotated an awful lot. But one of the things that it also sort of developed, I suppose you could say, was plastic surgery. So we look at the Battle of Britain and we tend to focus on the fighting side of it and everything else. What we don't always look at is in war there's developments when it comes to technology, medicine, and all those kind of things that people seem to forget about. Now, in World War I, a chap by the name of Harold Gillies had pioneered a kind of facial reconstruction for men who'd had their parts of their face blown off in the trenches.
Yep.
His younger cousin, a chap by the name of Archibald, I can't know if I pronounce it right, Mackindo, was also a plastic surgeon. He kind of trained under Gillies. And he was one of the ones who pioneered burns treatments. Because one of if a pilot was shot down, one of the most common injuries, and this is in the Battle of Britain, I think it's meant to be, isn't it, Christopher Plummer's character is the one that's meant to be badly burned. And there is actually, when his other half in the film she meets a pilot who'd been badly burned, and he was a genuine pilot from the Battle of Britain, the chap who you meet in it, who was badly burned. But that was very, very common. And what Mackindo actually pioneered was skin grafts, was how to treat the burns, because it was so common. So we've kind of got them to thank as well for pioneering that research. So much so, they actually had their own social club. Did you know this? The pilots who were injured in World War I, and predominantly these were burns victims, actually had something known as the Guinea Pig Club. And the badge they used to wear was a guinea pig with RAF wings. And this hospital was based in East Grinstead, and this was where Mackindo practised from. And there's a very good book that I'm going to try and get hold of a copy of, because I've read bits of it before, by he was a pilot in the Battle of Britain called Richard Hillary, who was injured. Mackindo basically put him back together. and he carried on flying, and then he did actually he did die flying during World War II. And he wrote a book called The Last Enemy, which is what it's like to be a pilot. Now he did, I believe he did get burned. I can't remember off the top of my head whether it was in a Spitfire or a Hurricane, but it was in one of them. And one of the sort of things that made me think is, why was it so common for these pilots to get burned, whereas in, say, World War One, when they're flying, you know, the Sopwiths, the Tiger Moths, and all those kind of biplanes, they weren't, because it wasn't just fuel they were burned by. A lot of them were burned by hot oil, and it got me to thinking as to why was this? Why was burns so common in these fighters? What do you think?
You had a higher octane fuel, I should imagine. You know, a lot more pure sort of like fuel. More powerful engines would have demanded more fuel on the sort of aircraft. Fuel tanks were situated more or less behind pilots. But as you say, Penny, a lot of them could possibly be sort of like high pressure oil burns as well, which would tend to come from the engine into the cockpit. So they would actually come from the engine to you.
I did look into this because it was something that's always interested. I've always wondered, and I actually spoke to somebody I know who's a pilot, my dad, and we were discussing this, and he said, as far as he's aware, the reason was because with the sort of biplanes and stuff, the fuel tank would be mounted on top of one of the wings, so sort of to the side of the pilot. So if the aeroplane got destroyed, the fuel would almost chuck out the back of the aeroplane. Whereas in things like the Spitfires and Hurricanes, the fuel tank was literally by the pilot's feet. So if the fuel tank got ruptured, or a pipe got ruptured, the fuel's going to kick straight back into the cockpit, which is enclosed. And a lot of them, you read those sort of stories of when they were crashing, their canopy was jammed. And they weren't able to open their canopies. So apparently that was what. There was also, I remember reading that the early Mark 1 and Mark 2 Spits, I think it was, the fuel pipes ran through the cockpit, so were very, very susceptible to being damaged if they were strafed or whatever. It also apparently affected the engine capacity when they went into a vertical climb. The pressure could drop off to the engine, so they couldn't keep climbing at the speed, so they had to work on that. But it's still a very terrifying, and it is in the Battle of Britain film. It might be a film from the 1960s, but if you've got a good imagination, you can imagine. And there's enough accounts from pilots who were caught in burning aircraft as to what it was like. And the other thing as well, when you bear in mind, and this is the same with all these aircraft, if you wanted to bail out of a fighter, there were no ejector seats. You basically had to open the canopy, take your straps off, and turn your aeroplane upside down.
Yeah.
And drop.
Either that would fly out, and jump off the wing.
Yeah. Most of them like to invert the aircraft and drop. That was the news gravity. But I mean, I kind of, it's the whole thing. I mean, as amazing it is, and I met Caroline Grace once, who owns. Well, she doesn't fly now. She's retired from flying it, but she flew the 2-seater Grace Spitfire that you see a lot of the demos. And her and I were talking about what it was like to fly. And she said, once you're up in the air, it's amazing. It's like driving a sports car. She says, but taking off and landing, you kind of just cross your fingers and hope. Because she said, when you're coming into land, once you get past a certain point, you can't see what you're landing at. You just hope.
The Spitfire was a particularly difficult aircraft to land because of its landing gear sort of configuration. The Hurricane was relatively straightforward, but the Spitfire was renowned for being difficult. Pilots didn't like that aspect of it.
No, she verified that. I mean, she verified that for me after she'd flown it into the airfield we were at. She was doing a demonstration because we started chatting about it. And she said, literally, you have to, at about 500 feet, you have to pin where it is you want to land, and then just hope that's where you're aiming. But once you're up in the air, it was never an easy aircraft to fly. It was like driving a sports car compared to driving a Fiesta, I suppose. But it was fun once you were up. But even takeoffs, you could cock up quite easily if you sort of went wrong. But it's still a beautiful aircraft. Now, talking about haunting-y type stuff, which is what I was going to get onto next before I start talking bigwing, which really did get... Once I got my head around it, it's a lot simpler than it looks because of all the arguments to do with it. But talking about hauntings, at RAF Manston, which I believe is in Kent.
Kent?
Yeah, it's still in Kent, isn't it? It's actually what is now Kent Airport.
Kent International, no.
Kent International, ooh la la. There was a flight officer, Peter Chesters, who actually survived being shot down in the Battle of Britain. And one of the benefits they had of, and this is going to relate when we start talking bigwing, is one of the arguments that was had was that the pilots should have been going out to the Channel and meeting the Luftwaffe before they got across the border. Whereas Park said, well, hang on, if they're shot down over the UK, it's A, easier to get them back to base, B, they're more likely to survive because they ain't going to drown, and C, we can normally keep a better eye on them. So we know what the pilots, we don't care what happens to the aircraft, we want to make sure our pilots are okay because they're more valuable than the bits of metal that they're flying. So Chesters did get shot down during the Battle of Britain. Didn't take him long, he was back up in the air again. But unfortunately he crashed 6 months later, actually at Manston, whilst I think he'd shot down a couple of Messerschmitts, and he was doing a victory roll in his Spitfire. And I'm not laughing at this, I promise, he miscalculated and crashed. His ghost is meant to haunt Manston Airfield, and apparently people who work there have reported seeing him walking about looking for his aircraft at Manston.
Well,
plausible.
Yeah, an interesting tale. If nothing
it's true.
Else,
the story is true. I double checked his records. The story is true. Another one I read about, another airfield in Kent. I think it was Kent. I read it at. Is it Tangmere? Tangmere, was that one in Kent? I think it was Tangmere. It was a pilot. He was doing night flights, and what apparently the Germans used to like to do was to send over one bomber so that everyone would scramble, and then have that bomber not do anything and fly off. So the aeroplanes would go, it's false alarm, coming to land, put their landing gear lights on, and then a whole squadron of bombers would come across to bomb the airfields, because that was one of the philosophies they had during the Battle of Britain. It was kind of split into 3 sections, wasn't it? And one of them was bomb the heck out of the airfields. Hence Duxford getting bombed in the film.
That was a favourite sort of tactic, was to bounce aircrafts as they were landing at night.
Yeah, because the landing lights would go on and everything else.
Yeah.
Well, this pilot, he was doing a night flight, and I think he actually said he was in a hurricane, but he was doing a night flight. He was one of the most experienced sort of officers, and they put these very, very vague lights on for the pilots to come in to see. The pilots knew what they were looking for, but the enemy wouldn't necessarily know that's what it was. And apparently he was coming into the lights, and he did what's called a touch and go. So as he's coming in, he just throttles back and takes off again, and he's radio silent because they think there's Germans in the area. He did it again. He did another come round, took off again before he could touch down, and their thought was like, is it because he can't see the runway? Because it's notorious for damaging them, no lights pretty much. Yeah. And you're trying to land a sort of a quite flighty fighter. And so they turned a few more lights on, thinking, well, we've got to get him down, even if there are Heinkels and Dorniers and everything else buzzing around above our heads. And he got down, and this flight lieutenant apparently came storming into the sort of the air traffic control, the tower, sort of demanding to know who the idiot was in the biplane who was cutting him off. And they were like, there's nobody else out there, you're the only one. And he maintained that someone in a biplane had cut in front of him as he was trying to come into land. And they're like, no, you're the only there is no biplane, we're standing here, we watched you, there is no... And apparently he maintained all along that someone in a biplane had cut in front of him. And this was a former World War I site.
Again, another interesting story. It does remind me a bit of a novel I once read by Frederick Forsyth called The Shepherd. Sort of like a phantom aircraft guiding a sort of a lost aircraft into land, and etc. So and these stories certainly do crop up and appear.
They definitely do. So on to Big Wing, because I said I'd talk about Big Wing. Okay, so, how much do you know about Big Wing?
Just the sort of basics, the concept you sort of touched upon earlier, you know, sort of, it was sort of like a controversial sort of like move, but I believe it was the right move. I can understand the logic behind it, is to let the enemy come pretty much right to the target, which in this case would have been London, and then take them on there.
On your own turf.
Your planes have got more fuel and stuff. The enemy aircrafts, and especially their fighter escorts, will only have limited time before they have to leave bomber streams and go back. So, yeah, I think it was a good strategy all round.
Right, this is my take on it. This is going to be pretty contentious. Although what Richard Estep wrote when I said about what I'd finally mastered Big Wing, and I actually agree with what he said. He said it's all to do with egos, and I do kind of agree with him on that. But so, although we've got more than one group running the fighter side of things, there was two main ones who basically competed against each other. So you had Keith Park running 11 group, and then you had Lee Mallory running 12 group. Lee Mallory was jarred off. I mean, that's technical speak for you there. Jarred off that Keith Park was getting all the glory, because 11 group were the ones who were doing most of the air combat because of the area they were in, and 12 group were there as backup if they needed extra people. Lee Mallory, from what I can understand from reading about him, was a bit more sort of fight first, ask questions later, whereas Park was a bit more sort of not conscientious, that's the wrong word, but a bit more sort of conservative in his approach, shall we say. So Keith Park didn't want all of his squadrons going up at one time, because as far as he was concerned, if all of them are up there, there's going to be more destroyed, more pilots killed, and we can't replace the pilots fast enough.
Right.
What Lee Mallory said was, no, hang on, you get everyone up there and create the Big Wing, i.e. like a big, like almost like an impenetrable defence line, I suppose you could say, of fighters. You meet them. We know the radar's telling us where they are. We can catch them over the channel. We meet them over the channel and drive them back. Park's argument against it was, well, hang on, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. This isn't quite what he said, but this is how I'd paraphrase it. You're putting all your eggs in one basket, and the time it would take to get all those aircraft up and together from all the different sites, and at the height you want them, by that time you would have told the enemy where you were, because they would have found out. You'd have lost the element of surprise, and you'd just been trying to use bully boy tactics. However, Lee Mallory did have some quite vocal supporters, one of which being Douglas Bader.
Yes, that's correct.
The guy who lost his legs showboating in the 1930s, but was actually still a fighter ace. Now, the film about him, Reach for the Sky, brilliant film. Not what he was like. He was not a very nice person, Douglas Bader.
No, by all accounts. Yeah.
Even he said everyone thinks he's Kenneth More, because Kenneth More played him in the film. And he said, no, I'm not nearly as nice as that. And he wasn't. He was an arrogant SOB, sorry. He was not a very nice person. But then again, I suppose that's why he was successful and he still flew with two false legs. However, he was on Lee Mallory's side for whatever reason, whether it's political or not, I don't know. But Keith Park sort of stood his ground and said, no, I don't want to do it, it's not going to work. And to be fair, Dowding agreed with him.
Yeah.
And historians looking at it now, there's still mixed views on whether it would have worked or not. Personally, I actually agree with what Park said. It would have taken them too long to get up in the air. They would have lost the element of surprise. You would have lost more pilots, more aircraft, and you would have put all your eggs in one basket, because you can look at how long it used to take the bombers to form up when they were doing those kind of big formations.
Fly over, yeah.
Yeah. Alright, the bombers weren't as fast as the fighters, but it still took a long time for all the different squadrons to form up when they were doing the big bomb runs. And I actually agree with Park. I think it was a stupid idea, and I think it was Lee Mallory sort of trying to make Park look stupid. The unfortunate thing is, quite soon after the Battle of Britain, Keith Park lost his role with 11 Group, and Dowding lost his role as head of fighter command.
That's right. There's a lot of political sort of moving and shaking. I mean, but to sort of like get your way up to sort of that sort of level of command, you know, these were the sorts of people that done it. You know, the arrogant, the sort of forceful, you know, it's just, and throughout history, sort of like generals and have always argued with subordinates, and subordinates have always argued that they're better than person who's actually commanded. So yeah, it's all grist for the mill.
Yeah, but that was basic bigwing, literally forming a huge, I say defensive line, probably more of an attacking line was the thing that Mallory had envisaged, and putting all the eggs in one basket. But when you look at the comparison of how many British and Commonwealth aircraft there was compared to how many German aircraft, he would have fallen flat on his backside, because RAF squadrons had 9 to 12 aircraft in per squadron.
Yeah.
The Luftwaffe had 30 to 40 because they included bombers in their squadrons when they'd come over. You also had, but then you start looking at the sort of level of, I suppose, deaths. We lost 522 pilots, according to the statistics I found at the International War Museum. Mm-hmm. The Germans lost 3,336 pilots. We lost 900 fighters. They lost well over 1,000. These are just fighters, not their bombers as well. So when you look at those kind of figures, you can see the amount of, you know, they outnumbered us by this kind of a defensive or attacking line, whichever you want to call it. It wouldn't have worked. They would have been squashed. That's my view, anyway. Yeah,
and I can see where you're coming from with that view. Yeah, it's perfectly valid. Yeah, but I was always sort of like you know, it worked at the end of the day. You know, it you know, and you know, needs must when the devil drives. So you can sort of like look back with hindsight. But yes, I can certainly see the RAF's role actually during the Battle of Britain, and even after the Battle of France. They were very wise, you know, and even before Dunkirk, you know, they were sort of drawing the RAF out of France because they knew there was a battle coming, and they were to switch the role to a defensive role as opposed to an offensive role. Yeah. And they needed time to equip and train pilots for a defensive sort of operations as opposed to offensive.
Exactly. Well, some of the other interesting paranormal stuff I discovered. I'll give you a couple more paranormal things I discovered. One of the pilots who died, a chap I mentioned, he was 19 years old. He was based, I believe, at Biggin Hill, or he was either Biggin Hill or Hawkinge. He flew a Hurricane with 32 Squadron. He actually downed in the Channel, and they believe he drowned in his aircraft when he downed in the Channel. Well, there was a couple of people recently who maintained that they connected with him in a spiritual group, and that he's come to them and talked to them about what it was like. And on the anniversary of his death, they threw reefs into the Channel where his aircraft was meant to be, because they maintain he talks to them. I don't know whether that's true or not, but interestingly enough, his surname was Gilman with 2 L's, and one of the people who say they speak to him is Gilman with 1 L. And he said he's always felt a connection to him, but he also said he felt a connection to Guy Gibson, and we know I'm the only person who has a connection to Guy Gibson. So unless Guy's playing around on me, who knows? Who knows? He's cheating on me. Yeah. The other paranormal thing I thought was quite interesting was Hugh Dowding himself was actually a spiritualist.
Yes.
He also believed in fairies.
Yeah, much maligned after the war. I mean, his role, very crucial during the war, but we seem to have this habit in this country that a lot of our sort of look at Alan Turing and stuff like that, you know.
Bomber Harris.
And we use them for their sort of what they done, and then we discard them and malign them afterwards. You know, not fair.
No, there's an awful lot of these people who I think did an amazing job with the resources that they had. But yes, Hugh Dowding, he was ridiculed quite a bit because it wasn't till after the war he became vegetarian. He worked a lot with the anti-vivisection societies back before it was kind of cool to do it.
Yeah.
But he was also a practicing spiritualist and believed in fairies, which I thought was quite interesting for a man who sort of flew himself during World War One. You know, was responsible for possibly what they class as Britain's finest hour. He would have probably been a cracking guest on one of these shows, wouldn't he? Really?
Yeah. You can possibly, these sort of like men, they grew up during sort of different times, and they were faced with adversity and a lot of sort of responsibility, and perhaps that is one of the drivers that makes you a more sort of spiritual person.
Maybe.
You know.
Maybe. Who knows? Who knows? Well, how's your first show being a sort of guest on mine on Haunted Histories? How's it
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah?
Yes, it's gone really well, thank you. And thanks for having me. I enjoyed what you had to say.
Thank you. Well, seeing as you're responsible for me unleashing this monster, Richard.
Well, there you go. I mean, I've
all
made
those years ago.
All those years ago, yes. It must be about sort of 2 or 3 years ago now, wasn't it? And
Nearly three.
And that was at a World War II air base, so there you go.
It was, yes, Rougham. Yep, it was indeed. I remember it well. I thought you were joking when you first asked me. But yeah, you unleashed a monster. So would you recommend the Kent Battle of Britain Museum if anyone's down that way?
I'd thoroughly recommend it. But if anyone's sort of listening and thinking, I'll go down there in a couple of months, it's October is the last month it's open for this year, and then it closes for the winter and is open again in April. So if you do plan to pay a visit this year, you've got the rest of this month to do it.
Actually, that's the same with North Weald Museum is the same, I believe.
Prices are reasonable. Adults £8, senior citizens £7.50, and children under 15 are £4.
Yeah.
So,
but you can actually do quite a lot of exploring in Kent of all the battles. I know there's a monument. Is it a chapel in the Firth or something it's called?
Yeah.
There's loads of stuff to do with the Battle of Britain down there if you look around.
There's certainly a lot in Kent too, and if you're interested in sort of like the military history, even around Chatham, the dockyards, and as you know, dockyards, and there's certainly it's a good county to go and wet your whistle, I suppose. All things history.
Cool. Yeah, I'm biased. It's all about aeroplanes for me, I'm afraid. Don't do that water stuff.
I history either.
I'd rather go up in the air. Well, that's been my show for this week. Thank you ever so much for being my guest, Richard. I'm much appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me on, Mary.
And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed being able to talk, and I hope we didn't bore everyone listening. I hope you enjoyed listening to us talk about World War One and maybe hopefully Big Wing. You kind of, I'd be interested to know what people think, whether they think it was a foolish decision or if they can see the logic behind it, or was it just Lee Mallory trying to get one up on his rivals because he wanted the more prestigious group, if we can say, which he did actually get, I believe, afterwards. So next week I am going to be talking to my Scottish brother from another mother, Mr. Ryan Griffiths. We're going to be talking about the Shetland Islands and some haunted stuff to do with that. It'll be interesting. I never even thought of the Shetland Islands, but I know Ryan's working on a documentary about the Shetland Islands, so it's going to be another learning experience for yours truly, which I absolutely adore being able to do. Shows on 5 nights of the week. You can, and in fact on a Tuesday we have 2 shows. That's how good we are to you. Aren't you lucky? Don't forget to head on over to YouTube, click like, share and subscribe, and I hope to see you all next week. But on that note, have a good evening, sleep tight, don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.